In last week's video, we looked at 10 cities and towns that developers tried to build from scratch, and in those 10 cases, they failed before they ever even got started. In this week's video, we're going to look at something a little bit different. We're going to look at 10 cities and towns that were highly successful at one point in time, and then for one reason or another collapsed and are ghost towns today. Kicking off the list at number 10, we have Logan Triangle in North Philadelphia. Beginning in the late 1800s and continuing through the 1920s, the Logan Triangle area of Philadelphia was used as a place to dump toxic coal ash. Over the years, the ash piled up to the point where it was between 30 and 60 feet deep. In the 1920s, to accommodate Philadelphia's booming population, builders began to build houses on top of the old coal ash piles. Decades later, in 1959, several gas explosions shook the neighborhood. The unstable soils had caused a 30-inch gas main to settle and rupture, which led to explosions. The damage was repaired, but nothing was done to address the larger problem of the neighborhood being built on top of unstable and toxic materials. Several decades later, in 1986, explosions rocked the neighborhood again. Again, a ruptured gas main was to blame. This time, the city took a closer look at the problem and began to realize its magnitude. Nearly 1,000 homes were declared unstable, with 23 being classified as being in danger of imminent collapse. According to the Army Corps of Engineers, stabilizing the area would cost $50 million or more. Additionally, there was extremely high levels of toxins that were finally recognized. Over the next 15 years, the neighborhood was almost completely cleared out, with 35 acres of homes demolished. Today, the area is one of the largest undeveloped areas within the city of Philadelphia. Several redevelopment plans have been considered, including a youth sports complex, but so far, none of these have made it past the planning stage. At number 9, we have Bodie, California. America's western frontier was known for its boom towns, particularly during the second half of the 1800s. Driven by an economic spark, these towns would spring up from nothing virtually overnight. Then, when the economic driver would begin to fade away, so too would the town, and in many cases, it would fade away just as quickly as it grew. Bodie, California was one of the most famous examples of such a town. In 1870, Bodie was a relatively small and unremarkable mining camp in eastern California. 10 years later, the population had exploded to nearly 10,000 following the discovery of several rich gold deposits in the area. In only a few years, over 2,000 buildings had been built, including 65 saloons along Main Street. Like many frontier towns, Bodie was known for its extraordinarily high homicide rate. On a per capita basis, it was estimated to be several times more violent than the most violent cities of today. Interestingly, almost all these murders involved willing combatants in the form of duels, and random violence was actually pretty uncommon. By the 1880s, the town had already started to decline, and by the 1890s, the town's population was down below 1,000, a 90% decline from its peak. Mining would continue on and off for the next 50 years, but it would never come close to the profitability that it saw during the boom years. World War II sealed the town's fate when World War II production boards shut down all non-essential gold mining in the U.S. In the 1940s, the town's population officially dropped to zero. Today, Bodie's been transformed into a tourist destination with around 100 structures from the town semi-preserved in a similar state to how they were left abandoned a century ago. At number 8, we have Shenandoah Woods, a former military housing complex in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Built in 1974 on 55 acres, it was originally 199 townhouse units spread across 40 buildings. The neighborhood faced significant issues surrounding a polluted water table which leaked in from nearby military facilities. Efforts to remediate the problem were undertaken, but they weren't particularly effective. The neighborhood would begin to empty out around the year 2000, and it was designated a blighted area by 2011. Several years later, a redevelopment plan was proposed which would include 175 new townhouses as well as park space, but this plan didn't come to fruition. The old homes were demolished, and for now it appears that the area will remain green space. Next up, we have Eagle Mountain, California. The town that some have referred to as America's newest ghost town, Eagle Mountain, California, has a bizarre and fascinating history. It began in the 1940s as a mining town to support the nearby Eagle Mountain iron ore mine. The mine was highly productive and the town boomed for its first 25 years in existence. with the population of the small desert town reaching 4,000. In 1977, the mine celebrated a major milestone when it shipped its 100 millionth ton of iron ore. At this point, though, the town's fortunes began to change. At the end of the 1970s, the mine began to falter as increased environmental regulations and new foreign competition began to take its toll on the mine's success. By 1980, the mine had closed and the town's population began to decline rapidly. Most of the small businesses in the town closed within several years of the mine closure. The town sat idle for much of the 1980s until later in the decade when part of the town's buildings would be renovated into a prison. Unfortunately, a serious prison riot that left 2 dead and dozens injured led to the closure of this prison facility in 2003. Following this, plans were drawn up to convert the old mine into a landfill. After decades of planning, this was ultimately not pursued. At number 6, we have the Pruitt Igoe homes in St. Louis. After a population boom that saw St. Louis's population grow by over 50% in the first half of the 1900s, St. Louis officials were scrambling to ease the housing crunch that had developed. To make matters worse, much of the housing stock, particularly for low-income residents, was deteriorating badly. Densely packed apartments with substandard living conditions, including things like communal bathrooms, were still very common at this time. Officials saw high-rise public housing as a way to provide efficient yet clean and safe housing for these residents, and often referred to them during the planning stages as poor man's penthouses. Construction began on the Pruitt Igoe homes in 1951, and while they were being built, the feedback was generally positive. Famed architect Minoru Yamasaki, most famous for designing the World Trade Center, was one of the key designers of the project. By 1955, the 33-building complex was finished and began to welcome new residents. This was just before public housing was desegregated in St. Louis, so originally the plans called for the housing blocks to be segregated based on race. A year later, a judge's ruling would end segregation within the St. Louis public housing system. The honeymoon period for the new apartment complex wasn't long, and within years of opening, occupancy had already begun to decline. This, combined with a lack of maintenance and rapidly spreading sense of lawlessness, led to a downward spiral for the complex. It would soon become notorious for crime and rapid deterioration. Before it had even been around for a full decade, the occupancy rate was nearly cut in half. Everything from mechanical systems to windows to elevators and playgrounds suffered major damage to the point that by the late 1960s, the complex was mostly abandoned. In 1968, officials were trying to figure out what could be done to save the complex, but a few years after that, the decision was made that they were beyond repair and would need to be demolished. The Pruitt Igoe homes have gone down in history as one of the most infamous failed public housing and urban renewal projects in American history. Henry Ford was one of history's most successful industrialists, but even for him, not every project was a success. In the mid-1920s, he sought to establish a new source of rubber for tires for his cars. After considering places in Central America, he ultimately settled on a deal that would establish a rubber processing town in northern Brazil. This deal would send 9% of the town's profits to the Brazilian government in exchange for 2.5 million acres of land. Work started in 1926, and by 1928 the industrial town had been created. It was mostly self-sufficient and included production facilities, residential units for workers, libraries, a golf course, and even a hospital. It wasn't long, however, before the project began to run into problems. The site was difficult to access, which led to logistical challenges. Additionally, diseases such as yellow fever were unfortunately common. Furthermore, Ford's advisors lacked a strong understanding of rubber tree cultivation, leading to rubber production that was far below expectations. Possibly the biggest issue of all when it came to Fordlandia was the clash of cultures that was created. Ford's town had a very American feel to it, which was despised by the Brazilians who were working there. At one point, the American food being provided led to an uprising known as the Breaking Pans Revolt. After sabotaging production, hiding in nearby jungles, and threatening cafeteria staff, locals finally got Ford to agree to provide local food. The town also had strict rules against alcohol, tobacco, women, and even some sports. This too led to resentment from the workers. All these factors, combined with new sources of rubber becoming available, including synthetic rubber, led to Ford eventually deciding to abandon the project in 1934. The town sat virtually untouched for 80 years. Recently, people have begun to move back into the old houses, and as of 2020, the estimated population was up to 3,000. Within the thin strip of land between North and South Korea, known as the DMZ or Demilitarized Zone, lie two unusual villages. One is on the southern portion and is a small but thriving village under South Korean control. On the northern section of the DMZ lies a much stranger town known as Kijong-Dong, which translates to Peace Village. Based on South Korean reports, this town was built in the early 1950s as part of a propaganda campaign to encourage South Koreans to defect to the north. The village, which is visible from the south, was built to appear to be a great place to live. The buildings were brightly colored and the streets were well maintained. When it was first built, the town even included electric streetlights, something that was very uncommon in this part of the world at the time. An observer from a distance would see an idyllic town filled with economic prosperity and success, or so the North Koreans hoped. Unfortunately for them, it was just a little too close to the south. Using telescopes and binoculars, South Korean observers began to realize that the whole town was nothing more than a facade. These observers report that there's no actual residents living in the village and that many of the buildings are little more than shells with no interior rooms. Reportedly, many of the windows weren't even fitted out with glass. The town has also served as a location for several bizarre feuds between the North and South. Loudspeakers on some of Peace Village's buildings play propaganda extolling the virtues of North Korea as much as 20 hours a day. In the early 2000s, there was a ceasefire of sorts where both sides agreed to turn off the propaganda loudspeakers. This ended in 2016 following escalating tensions surrounding missile testing. The two towns in the DMZ have also had a battle of who can have the biggest flagpole. After the South Korean side put up a 35-story flagpole, the North Korean responded shortly thereafter with a 53-story flagpole. Like so many others, the mining town of Kennecott, Alaska experienced a dramatic rise and fall in the early 20th century. The story began in 1900 when prospectors discovered a rich copper deposit near Kennecott Glacier. This led to the formation of Kennecott Copper Corporation, which quickly grew into one of the largest mineral companies in the world. By 1911, a 196-mile railroad was constructed to transport copper ore to Cordova, marking the beginning of an industrial boom. At its peak, Kennecott employed around 600 workers and produced almost 5 million tons of ore, generating revenues exceeding $200 million. However, by the late 1920s, geologists predicted the depletion of high-grade ore in the area. The Great Depression further impacted copper prices, leading to the closure of the mines in 1938. The once bustling town rapidly transformed into a ghost town. Despite attempts to revive mining activities in the late 1960s, high costs rendered them unprofitable. Today, Kennecott stands as a National Historic Landmark within Wrangell-St. Elias National Park, attracting tourists who explore its preserved structures and learn about its storied past. Central Pennsylvania is well known for its long coal mining history. One of the most notorious mines in the area was the Centralia mine. Mining began in 1856 and lasted for more than a century. During that time, the small town of Centralia sprung up nearby, filled with mostly mining employees. At its peak, the town had around 3,000 residents. Then, in 1962, a fire started in an underground seam of coal. Although there's some debate as to what ignited the fire, the general consensus is that the fire started while mining waste was being burned. Some suggested that this fire had been smoldering since decades before, but this has never been proven. The full extent of the fire wasn't initially understood, but in the years following, the issues would become more and more apparent. Noticeable plumes of smoke and bad odors became increasingly common throughout the small town. In one of the more shocking incidents, a local gas station owner was checking the levels of the fuel in the tanks, and he noticed that the tanks felt hot. After lowering a thermometer into the gas, the man was surprised to see that the gas was a toasty 172 degrees Fahrenheit. Firefighting efforts began in the early 1960s and continued unsuccessfully for decades. With the fire taking place underground and in the middle of a substantial seam of coal, little could be done to extinguish the flames. By the early 1980s, citing serious safety concerns, including fiery sinkholes and toxic fumes, the government began aggressively relocating residents. In 1992, the government declared eminent domain, and over the next several years, the town was abandoned. Today, the fire still burns, although during a recent visit, several locals commented that visible signs of the fire are far less obvious than they used to be in previous decades. Virtually all structures in the town have been demolished, and all that remains is a small, overgrown street grid. One of the most notable attractions, Graffiti Highway, was recently covered with a layer of dirt to discourage visitors from trespassing onto private property. And finally, at number 1, we have Picher, Oklahoma. After incorporating in 1918, the town of Picher grew rapidly during the first part of the 1920s. Propelled by a booming mining industry nearby, the town had 14,000 residents by the middle of the decade. Reportedly, half of all lead and zinc used in World War I came from the northeastern Oklahoma area, which included towns like Picher. Slowly, however, the mining industry in Picher began to decline, and by the late 1960s, it had ceased entirely. What was left behind was a dangerous mix of toxic mining byproducts and severely undermined buildings due to reckless subsurface operations. The Army Corps of Engineers reported that over 80% of the town's buildings were undermined and could collapse at any time. To make matters worse, health screening showed that many of the residents, particularly children, had dangerously elevated levels of lead and other heavy metals in their blood. The town's population had been dwindling prior to these revelations, but once the information was well known, the exodus quickened. In 2008, a tornado devastated much of what was left of the town, and in 2009, the Oklahoma government declared the town uninhabitable. Although a few residents initially refused to move, nearly everybody left, and by 2010, the population of the once booming town was reportedly 10. The last remaining resident passed away in 2015, officially bringing the population to 0. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe if you like this content, and new videos every Friday.